This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
For over 3 decades, Africa has traditionally been the first stop at the beginning of each year for Chinese foreign ministers in their annual global tour. Now 2023 is no different. China's new foreign minister Qin Gang arrived in Africa this week on a tour that takes him to 5 countries: Ethiopia, Gabon, Angola, Benin and Egypt. And in Ethiopia, Foreign Minister Qin visited the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, where he presided over the completion ceremony of the first phase of the China-built Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention headquarters. Now, this week on the program, we delve deeper into the significance of the Chinese foreign minister's visit to the African Union and what to expect in China-Africa relations in the year ahead. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. China has had long-standing diplomatic and economic ties with Africa. Now, among other things discussed during his visit, Mr. Qin Gang spoke about the need for solidarity and cooperation in Africa. Let's listen in.
Africa is a rising continent, a land of hope. It is full of vigor and dynamism. The stability of prosperity of the world is impossible without the peace and development of Africa. What Africa needs is solidarity and cooperation, not bloc confrontation. No country, no people have the right to force the African countries and peoples to take sides. Africa should be a big stage for international cooperation, not an arena for major country competition.
Well, joining me now to take a closer look at the significance of Chinese Foreign Minister's 2023 visit to Africa, from Beijing, Professor John Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. From Johannesburg, Professor David Monyae, Director and Professor at the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies. And here in Nairobi, Ambassador Erastus Mwencha, former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Gentlemen, welcome to the program and thank you for your time. Ambassador Mwencha, let me start off with you here, because China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang continued with the long-standing tradition of Chinese diplomacy for China's foreign ministers visiting Africa at the start of each year. First off, what are your thoughts on the Foreign Minister's Africa tour kicking off at the African Union?
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and also acknowledge the presence of my colleagues. You summed it up very well in your intro when you mentioned that this visit comes as a long tradition of China's foreign ministers coming to Africa at the beginning of each year. Now, that of course sums it all to indicate that China took a long shot to put Africa as a priority, and significantly also to indicate that this happened to be soon after the collapse of the Cold War. And as you remember that after the collapse of the Cold War, many people thought that Africa would be abandoned because there was no significance that Africa was playing beyond that Cold War, that Africa was a conflict zone. But there is also a significance part of it, because Africa, as the foreign minister indicates, is a rising continent with 1.3 billion people, with a GDP of over 3 trillion, and of course endowed with also a lot of resources. China itself being the second largest economy in the world, there is no way you can avoid the two coming together to develop cooperation. And of course, this relationship is not just because of those fundamentals. It is also historical, because you remember China supported Africa, in search for freedom from colonialism and apartheid, and this trend has continued. But the new frontier now is economic war, and China is in the forefront of continuing to foster cooperation between Africa and China.
Well, this is a very weighty political message. Professor Monyai there, you know, in his meeting with the African Union Commission chairperson, the foreign minister said, and as Ambassador Moncha has rightly put it, China and Africa are standing at a new historical starting point. So what definitive issues are coming out of the tour?
I think firstly, we have to understand three major factors that defines this year's visit. One has to do with the pandemic, COVID-19, and the just recent reopening of China. The second has to do with impending geopolitics, the so-called new Cold War. And within that, I think we see global economy not doing well. There are a number of issues where Africa increasingly is becoming a center of attention, not just from China, United States, and other strategic partners. We also see this visit comes at a time when the United States Secretary of State Blinken visited the continent, with the high chances that President Biden will visit the continent this year, as he promised during the summit. Similarly, the BRICS summit that is going to take place in June in South Africa, chances are also equally high that President Xi Jinping will also visit the African continent. So all these factors read together gives us quite an interesting time for the continent where strategic big powers have major interests, especially Africa, China, where the interest is increasing in terms of trade volumes and people-to-people relations.
Right, Professor Gong, a lot to consider there from the foreign minister's visit. Let me get your reaction to that Africa tour, particularly coming at a time when China has opened up post-pandemic.
Thanks for having me. I'd like to start with highlighting the fact that Foreign Minister Qin Gang has just took office just a few days ago, actually. And it's very significant to me that his first trip outside of China after taking that position is Africa. In addition to the fact that we have a tradition here that the foreign minister from China usually goes to Africa at the beginning of the year. And I think that's a very significant event. It highlights the importance of the whole African continent in China's foreign policy. And as we all know it, China is a major player in Africa. If you go to Africa everywhere, you see bridges, roads, stadiums, hospitals, built with the systems or with some kind of financing from China. And we all know that we came from the same history, the history of anti-colonialism, Western hegemony. So, we have a lot of things in common. So I think, the importance of this relationship cannot be emphasized. But I totally agree that we are into a new era right now, against the backdrop of this, broader competition between the United States and China, which is actually unilaterally initiated by Washington. Right. Nevertheless, it's something we have to accept and we have to answer to. Against that backdrop, China's engagement in Africa is actually not towards sort of targeting the United States. Our engagement in Africa started long before President Trump, ex-President Trump, and Biden started this policy. So I think it's fundamentally based on benefits for both sides. It's fundamentally based on the gains and from trade and gains from investment, from cooperation. So it works very well in my view for Africa.
You talking about the current relationship being based on economic development. Trade and investment has been a key focus for China-Africa relations. Now, with the West still predicting an economic decline in 2023, what do we expect from China?
Honestly, China's economy hasn't been doing so well this year due to the pandemic. Previous year, 2020, due to the pandemic, understandably. But with the adjustment of the COVID policy, the country is opening up. I think, after initial ramp up of very rapid infections, we're starting to see things are coming down. In major cities like in Beijing, Shanghai, things are coming back to normal. Streets are getting crowded, malls are getting crowded, restaurants are getting crowded. So I think this year gives a promise of hope in my view. I think probably we're still going to get into a bit of a difficult time in the first weeks of the new year, but after that, I think we should be in much better shape. And the economic development in China, having a better shape in China also benefits Africa as well. And we import a lot of things from Africa, I hope these activities, especially investment activities associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, infrastructure build-outs in African countries will be not just resumed, but also strengthened. And I think China has no intention of backing off from this route. We're going to continue as we want to, and we're going to continue to develop closer relationships between the two sides.
Right. Let's continue on that economic development for a moment. Ambassador Mwencha, this visit, as we are mentioning, is coming at a time when China, is opening its borders after 3 years of closure. What do these changes in China's post-pandemic policy mean for trade and investment in Africa?
It is instructive to note that even during the period of COVID, trade between China and Africa was not significantly affected. As a matter of fact, this year, trade is expected to grow in excess of $260 billion between Africa and China, indicating the resilience of the trade that takes place between the two countries. But beyond trade, there is also the investment in the key areas that have been mentioned by the professor and also indicated by Professor Nyar. Now, this is just to indicate that the fundamentals that are in place that create this partnership between China and Africa are such that this partnership is for a long haul, in spite of these, hiccups that will be coming along the way. Beyond that, if you look at the cooperation that Africa and China continue to enjoy, especially in the area of investment, China, for the last 15 years, 13 years straight, has also remained the largest investor in Africa. And China continues to occupy that position in a very strategic manner, targeting sectors that many Western nations shied off in the past, particularly in the area of social infrastructure. And now we see particularly the actual infrastructures that are key to the economy. So this cooperation is strategic, is for a long haul, and indicates resilience.
Right. Professor Munyaya, this is what Ambassador Mwencha is mentioning now, that China has remained Africa's largest trading partner, actually for 13 years now in a row. And two-way trade in 2022 was expected to exceed $260 billion. China's imports from Africa as well grew faster than its exports to Africa, according to the foreign minister. So what's your reaction here?
I think these are interesting developments. And I think what we are seeing is the newly signed Africa Common Trade Agreement, a new way of doing business on the African continent. And within China itself, I think we have seen China opening up its markets, particularly to agricultural products coming from the African continent. So there are a lot of opportunities and challenges. Challenges in terms of the African continent taking advantage of adding value to the products that they are selling to ever-growing Chinese middle class. I think that's the key issue. Africa is going to compete with other developing countries in Asia, Latin America, and other parts of the world. And therefore, I think it is important for the African continent to avoid selling just raw material, ensure that we add value, create jobs on the African continent, and ensure that the trade is somehow fairly equal trade in terms of these volumes, which is quite promising. And according to the China-Africa Forum, there is no doubt that they're going to meet the target of going beyond the 300 billion. And I think we're going to see much more new issues coming in, particularly on issues of space, e-commerce, technology in general. And Africa should and must really ensure that it increases the regulatory framework within and between African countries, and ensure that there's more knowledge in terms of dealing with high-tech economy, opening up the blue economy, for instance. So it's quite interesting that China is continuing to engage the African continent, and this will encourage other countries to engage in a similar way.
All right, gentlemen, we'll continue with this discussion in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll look closer at how the Chinese foreign minister's visit may strengthen China-Africa policy this year. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Professor John Gong, Professor David Monyae, and Ambassador Erastus Mwencha. Now, before the break, we looked at the significance of Mr. Qin Gang's visit to the African Union. Let's now examine how China's Africa policy will adapt in an evolving global environment fraught with geopolitical intrigues. Professor Gong, let me start off with you here, because the foreign minister addressed the sensitive issue of Africa's debts. Now, according to a World Bank report, multilateral finance institutions and commercial creditors hold nearly 3/4 of Africa's overall external debt, the bulk of it actually. So why is China the only one accused of having an African debt trap narrative?
First of all, this narrative is totally wrong. I keep referring to a very detailed study of a scholar, professor at the Marion Williams College in the United States, actually located in Virginia. That university is a collection of data. That's what's called the A data regarding all the investments and projects in developing countries, and it's a very reliable database. I mean, this professor did a very detailed study, and her conclusion is that the whole idea of this debt trap is a total hoax. It doesn't hold water at all. This theory borders on lunacy. In my view, it's premised upon the assumption that the lenders are hoaxing to or swindling to something that it can never pay off. It's premised upon the assumption that the borrowers are stupid. It's premised upon the creditors, the lenders, getting to a arrangement that they know that the borrowers are going to default at some point in the future. This is total crazy to me. It's total conspiracy theory. So I think if you look at the history of this notion, it came from clearly a geopolitical maneuver. It refers to a situation Sri Lanka was first pointed out by some scholars in India. And coming from India, it's totally understandable to me why these people are doing this. Nevertheless, was picked up very quickly by some Western politicians, right, and they make a big deal of this, totally out of proportion. Even though I totally reject the notion of debt trap, but I am in the camp of taking a precautionary attitude towards taking on too much debt. There's no doubt about it. And I think it's up to the African side, the project owners, the African governments to make ultimately a decision with respect to how much debt they have to take on.
Ambassador Mwencha, what's your take on that?
In addition,
right. Go ahead, Professor Mwencha.
In addition to what the prof has put out, we also have to understand a number of key issues that China does not follow the Western way of lending as defined by the OECD. And therefore, I think that's where the major issue comes, where Western countries wants to force China to follow the OECD. Something that comes with conditionality, and beyond that, it's just competition between China and Western countries. So we need to understand these factors before we blindly follow the so-called debt trap. And the other important is also it's our historical, the so-called debt trap. If you go back historically, the end of Cold War, the end of Second World War, particularly in Europe, there was a lot of borrowing that the United States itself played a critical role in the Marshall Plan, reconstruction, development of major infrastructure after the war. And this kind of borrowing, it took time for Western countries, particularly in Europe, to repay United States. And similarly, to expect Africa borrowing and within a short space of time pay back that money, it does not make sense, any economic sense. Infrastructure finance takes time. It's a gradual process, and therefore it requires the role of the state to create a conducive environment, ensure that you grow your market, ensure that economic activities, particularly on our continent where we need much more to close the bottlenecks in terms of trade among ourselves, to increase the volume of trade among African countries. And therefore, there is, and I agree with the prof, there is a need for Africans to be trained to understand how to negotiate deals. It's very important. So the question of debt crisis is not just to China, it's to all other lenders. And if you look at the true picture of debt in Africa, Western countries have much more debt in Africa than China.
Ambassador Mwencha, your take?
Yes. As my two colleagues have indicated, if you look at the total debt stock of Africa now stands at over 700 billion US dollars. Of that, China only holds about 20%. But the way it's portrayed out there is as if China holds about 90% of that debt. And so a lot of, Western countries are coming to Africa or taking a stance that Africa should distance itself from China. Yet this debt stock is held by the same countries, if not the multilateral banks from those countries. But again here, if you look at the way Africa-China engages, this is a mutual relationship where Africa, normally under the FOCAC forum, where Africa presents its needs, and China then takes a selection of those projects that they think they have the capacity to be able to support Africa's development. So it's not like China is coming to Africa deciding, picking and choosing what they can do without Africa's consent.
Right.
Africa may be holding foreign debt, but a lot of Western countries are also having domestic debt. I mean, if you look at the inflation we are facing now globally, it is because of the stimulus package, which of course is a domestic debt that a lot of these countries have gone into, whether it's Europe or United States. So debt is being used as a weapon,
right,
but yet it's an instrument that is used particularly in correcting social or when countries face certain hiccups that we mentioned earlier.
Professor Gong, pick up on that for us for a moment. How do you see, though, the geopolitics playing out, even as Western powers now look to rebuild their relationships with Africa? What do you foresee?
Well, first of all, I don't think China is interested in competing with the United States in the geopolitical arena. I mean, I think from China's perspective, the relationship with Africa is mostly, I would just say mostly, overwhelmingly of a commercial in nature. It's coming from the perspective of economic development, benefits both sides. It's coming from the perspective of furthering the economic and people-to-people exchanges. It's mostly coming from that perspective. So I think the Chinese government has spelled out very clearly that we have no intention of engaging in this kind of a competition. We have no intention of exporting ideology or our model of doing things around the world. This is not our purpose. So, I think the so-called geopolitical competition is imposed upon us unilaterally, which in my view should be totally rejected. So in that regard, I think Washington is doing something that's of an entirely different nature. It is,
Right.
and I think it may not be beneficial to African people in African countries.
All right, gentlemen, I want to get your final comments. And very briefly here, I'll start off with you, Professor Munyai. What could be the next steps? What do you see as the next steps in furthering political cooperation and economic development of the Global South? Very briefly.
I think we're going to see a much more strengthening of relation among the Global South, opening up and democratization of these institutions, particularly United Nations Security Council, the G20 with the possible Africa AU gaining a seat way and above the seat held by South Africa, and more cooperation on health, on issues of conflict resolution and other key issues. And therefore, the future lies in the Global South. And we're going to see much more economic activities taking place going forward.
Ambassador Mwencha?
Yes. We're now in a post-COVID environment, which also opens up new opportunities. It's instructive to note that when the foreign minister was in Addis Ababa, he opened the new Center for Disease Control for Africa. This is again a new area for cooperation because health is emerging as a very important sector. There is also the environment that Africa is now facing increasing challenges, especially as we see the global changes that are causing problems in Africa, particularly drought and other aspects. But there is also the digital economy that Africa is opening to, and which foreign ministers indicated that will be a future area of cooperation between Africa and China, in addition to a new environment that China has also indicated that Africa and China will stand together, particularly in furthering Africa's interests in the global arena, and of course in the area of peace and security, including global peace and stability. All
right, Professor Gong, you have the final word.
Well, since Foreign Minister Qin Gang is visiting Addis Ababa, so I want to say a few words about Ethiopia. I think what Africa needs most is stability, political stability. Ethiopia could have been a role model for African countries in terms of African-China foreign economic cooperation, but unfortunately it was engaged in a civil war for many years. I have actually quite a few students of my own, PhD students, in Eastern African English-speaking countries, including Ethiopia. Some of them actually hold pretty important office, including the persons in Kenya as well. Unfortunately, political stability is something absolutely important for any talk about economic development. And I'm very happy that eventually they signed the peace deal, and I hope peace will truly prevail and truly come back to Ethiopia, and we can get onto the track of economic development in that wonderful country. And I hope for the best. I hope Minister Qin Gang's visit a great success in Africa.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for your insights on the program. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests. Professor John Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Professor David Munyai, Director and Professor at the University of Johannesburg, Center for Africa-China Studies, and Ambassador Erastus Mwencha, former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. To keep this conversation going, and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, it's bye-bye.